Just readjust this bit.
Should we put the lights off?
No, then you can't see me in the camera. Hey. All right. Well, welcome to our, one of the very many lessons. This specific course is on SQL Foundation. So this is basically where we're discussing the basics of the SQL, and then following on building up our skills on, basically managing SQL, creating queries, and just basically, covering the whole of SQL Server from the user perspective. Okay, first of all, this is what we're going to cover today in today's session, is what is SQL Server, how to get it, where to, and how to install it, what's SQL Server Management Studio, how to create users, logins, and what sort of roles SQL Server has got for users, what is a database, and where that database is actually stored, that is actually a physical file, and SQL Server actively using that file. Then another very interesting bit that we're going to look into is anatomy of SQL Server database file, how it's actually structured, the actual file itself, how the SQL Server reads the data out of that file. And create a basic query, and then finally we're going to look at some of the management queries. Management queries being how to create users, databases, drop databases, all those kind of things. Okay. So we start from, as I already mentioned, from the very, very basic. What is SQL Server? Well, SQL Server follows a client-server paradigm, which is there's a machine that acts as a client, so for example, this laptop, and there's a server. Also could be another laptop, another server, somewhere in the room, somewhere in the data center. And this client connects to that server over a network protocol and issues a command, well, a request to the server to get some results back. The server is doing all the work and returns all the results back to the client. So that's called the client-server paradigm. SQL Server is not a physical machine. It's basically a Windows service. It's still almost like an application that sits somewhere on a machine, and you can have multiple instances running on the same machine as well. And finally, we have a tool to play with given to us by Microsoft called SQL Server Express, which is exactly the same as in the normal, basically standard or enterprise edition of SQL Server database engine, just limited to certain things, such as, for example, the size of the database file you can have, how many users can log in, and how many processes you can actually use concurrently. Okay, so let's look at actually the diagram, what it looks like, the whole client-server paradigm. So we've got a machine, which is our server, and it can have all sorts of applications running, including web services and your website, including SQL Server as well. So you install SQL Server, and what you're doing, you're installing an SQL Server process on it. So it's, as I already mentioned, it's an application that runs on that server. And that's got databases connected to it. So it's actually physical files that that process writes data and reads data from. Then you have clients connecting to that SQL Server via a network protocol of some sort, and this actually represents a network protocol. So, for example, this client in this case using a laptop with some kind of application like Linux, for example, and it connects directly to the database to throw commands, requests to the server. The server processes those requests and returns the results back. Then we've got people like sysadmins who can use things like console applications or SQL Server Management Studio to control that server or create databases and things like that. So that represents Beatrice, I suppose. And we can also connect a web service, for example, to the SQL Server. So we can get a web application to basically request data from the SQL Server and then present that data to the customers that view that web application. Okay, so that's basically the paradigm. That's how it looks. Okay, so let's actually go and have a look where we can download the SQL Server and how to install it. We're not actually going to follow through the installation because it's going to take ages, but I'm just going to show you where we can get one. And so if you go to Google, for example, and then just type something like SQL Server Express 2008 R2 or something like this, or 2012, it'll take you to a download page. Well, all you need to do there is just basically download it and run the installation. You have to be an admin on the computer to run it. It will install the SQL Server Express edition and all the tools that come with it, that you can actually view the database, create databases, etc. So, as I said, we're not going to actually follow through the installation. It takes a little bit of time. So once you install the SQL Server, as already mentioned, it's a process. Windows Service process, or Windows Service. So we can actually go to Admin Tools and Services, and we can find that service in this list. As you can see, it's right there. SQL Server, SQL Express. SQL Express being an instance name. So as I've already mentioned, you can have multiple instances running on the same computer. So I can install SQL Server multiple times on the same computer, or on the same machine, actually. So this is the server that is actually running. As you can see, current state of this process is running, meaning that my SQL Server is actually actively waiting for requests from the customer. Okay, so the tool that we can use that actually comes out of the box to connect to the server and issue some commands to it and create databases, etc., is called the SQL Server Management Studio. And once you install the SQL Server, it's going to be basically installed on your computer, and as you can see, it's right there, called SQL Server Management Studio. And if we launch that, we should be able to connect to our new instance of the server. So there you go. First thing to mention is the fact that we have two types of authentication in SQL Server. Actually, we've got 4, but in this specific session, we're just going to look at 2 of them. One of them is called Windows Authentication. This is where we use Windows login details to connect to your SQL Server. And then the other one is SQL Server Authentication. This is where we can create users directly on the SQL logins, directly on the server itself, give them passwords and all sorts of different permissions, and obviously issue them with a password, and then any kind of application that connects to the server would use that username and password. So we start off by connecting to our new instance, fresh instance of the SQL Server using Windows Authentication. Because when the server gets installed, first thing it does, it takes the user that is currently logged in to the server, to the machine that is installing that system, and it adds it as a system administrator to the server, so that you can first time connect to it and then you can configure the server. This is pretty much the process we're going to follow right now. So first thing, just basically open up. You need to go and pick up the server name. So by default, it'll just insert the one that you've installed, but if it didn't for some reason, you can go and browse different instances of your machine. But normally it would be something like this: your machine name, like in, if I browse all my servers, you can see this is my machine name for the laptop, slash SQL Express. SQL Express being the instance name, this is my machine name. But I can also just basically type dot there, and then slash, and then instance name. When you're working locally with the server, when the server is installed on the same machine you're working with, it's a really good idea to use this. And the reason for that is actually we're going to cover in the monster session, because it's actually using different protocol to communicate with the SQL Server. It's a lot faster as well. So, okay, so let's connect to it. And what we can see straight away is on the right-hand side, is called, well, left-hand side actually, Object Explorer. This is all the objects that are in our database, database server. You can see there are databases, some security objects, some server management objects, etc. The things that we're going to look at today is databases and security. Okay, so the first thing to do when you connect it and install the server is to configure. So obviously to create a new user on it. At the moment I'm logged in as local user using my Windows account, and what I need to do is to create a system administrator login. Actually, I don't need to do it, but I would like to do it. It's not like a rule that you have to do it, but it just makes things easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new login for the SQL Server under Security, Logins, New Login. And I'm going to select that I want to create SQL Server authentication. And give this user a name. Like, for example, I'm actually going to say this is going to be a super admin. Give them a password. Okay. So since this is the first user that I'm creating in the server, I need this user to be able to control the whole of the server installation. So be able to create new users, assign the roles to those users, and create new databases. So what I need to do is to go and give this user a role. Is another interesting, new concept that we're introducing is server roles. So server roles could be users that can read data, that can write data into it. A public role is just a user with no rights whatsoever. They just can connect to the server. They can maybe view some databases, but they can't actually read any data out of those databases. So in our case, what we need to do is to mark this user as a sysadmin. So by marking a user as sysadmin, meaning that this user will be able to do anything he pleases with any of the resources on the server, like drop database or create new one or drop different accounts, etc. So it's as the name kind of suggests, a super admin. So create that user as super admin, and now what we can do is we can actually open up another instance of SQL Server Management Studio and connect to the server using that new connect to the server using that new user that we created. So first thing to do is switch authentication mode from Windows authentication to SQL Server authentication, because that's the type of user we just created. Then we type his, basically the login name is the name of the login name that we just created, the password, and then connect. Okay, so let's break it down. On the left-hand side, we're normally going to have any other user. On the right-hand side, we're going to have the admin user. On the left-hand side, we're going to have just any other user that we're creating. Okay, so this on the right-hand side is our super admin login. And as you can see, I can go and actually basically look at the logins. I can go and control the server and do anything I want. So first thing I want to do as a super admin is to go and basically kill the Windows login that I've just been using to create that super admin. So this is the login that I'm using on this SQL Server Management in this Management Studio. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and deny access to the server for that user. So if I go into status and deny access and disable that login. Okay, so if I try to do anything with this server as a Windows authenticated user that I first connected to the server with, like for example, I try to refresh databases. I can't actually do that. Okay, let's say I want to create a new database. I get this message saying the account is disabled. Okay, so that's it. I killed that Windows authenticated user that I've used to install the system to begin with. And now I'm going to work as a new user, as a super admin, and then we'll be able to create new users, new databases, and so on. Okay. Right. So let's have a look at databases. Databases is where we store the data. This is where we read the data from, and so on. So databases actually are physical files that are on a hard drive somewhere, on a machine, on a SAN network, etc. And they pretty much consist of two things. MDF file. MDF is an extension of the file. So MDF actually stores the data, and the LDF file, this is a log file. So the way the SQL Server works is the first thing, it writes everything into LDF file. So any changes you make to the database, you run inserts or updates or you delete some data, the first thing it does, it writes it into LDF file, which is a log file, and then it takes that those changes and actually write it into a permanent data set called MDF file. Okay, and further down, it's a little bit later on, we're actually going to look at the anatomy of those files, how they actually structured. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and create a new database. So create a new database, and I'm going to call it, very imaginatively, new database. Okay. As I already mentioned, there are two types of files that we need to store on a hard drive for a database. It's called, let's just zoom in, rows data, which is where we store all our data itself, and log file as well. And we can go and specify a specific path where we want those files to be created. In my case, what I want to do is I want to go and create data file in the folder called, well, in the directory in my hard drive called SQL data, and my log file, I'm going to create an SQL log. Okay, so that's it. Hit OK, and now on the right hand side we're going to see a new database appearing. That database is going to have no tables, no views, nothing, no objects basically, because it's a fresh one, right? So we can actually go into a hard drive. Okay, so these are two folders that I specified where my database files will be created, and if I look into it, you can see there is new database.mdf file being created. I can go and try to delete it, and I won't be able to do anything with that file. I won't be able to even open it with any kind of editor, because SQL Server is actively using that file. It's actively reading and writing data into it. So when the service is running, the files that are used as database storage are actively used. Right. Okay, so let's jump back into SQL Server Management Studio. And what we want to do next is we want to create a user login. User login is someone who is actually going to be connecting to our server and using the data database to read and write data to. And they're not going to have any access to any kind of other functionality within SQL Server. They won't be able to create any users and so on. They're also going to be restricted to read data only out of that new database. So what I need to do is to create a new login. Again, pretty much the same process as we followed. And in this case, I'm going to give him a different name. I'm going to call him a change name, change man, actually. Just a dummy password. Okay. And under server roles, I'm going to do nothing. I'm just going to say this user's roles are going to be just public role. So no rights to begin with as such. Okay, so there you go. We created a new user called changeman. And then I'm going to go and try to log in to the database. Using that new user. Okay, so again, on the left hand side, we're going to have that restricted, well, this just a normal user of the database. On the right hand side, we're going to have super admin, so we can distinguish which one can do what. Okay, since we created this user as a SQL Server authentication, that's the option we need to select in the authentication mode. And then finally test. Well, for the password, okay. Okay, so we've logged in, and as you can see, even though we haven't given this user any kind of roles, they can still see all the databases. They can see all the logins that are pretty much on the same level as they are. Although this user can see the database, he can't use that database, so he can't actually view inside it. So we can actually get that user and restrict access to viewing objects on the server as well. It's a bit more complicated. So in the meantime, we just want to make sure that they can't read any data out of any resources we haven't given them access to. Right, so I think that's the kind of the first thing that we've done. And just to elaborate what we've done, oh, it's going to go screw on me again, isn't it? Come on. Okay, so we've almost, let's imagine we installed the server and we had the local user that we installed the server with, and being able to connect to that server. We created a database of specified MDF and log files where they're going to be stored. We then created a super admin, and then we also denied access to the local user that created that server to begin with to be able to access that server. So now we have to do all the management operations on the server using that super admin or sysadmin rights. And we also created just a normal simple user with no rights to it whatsoever. Okay, so the next thing is what we want to do is we want to actually create a table and just play around with actually running some queries against it. But first of all, let's just go and create a table in the database. And what do I need to create in there? Okay, let's say we create an order ID as a column. Custom name is going to be a bar chart. We're going to go through the types in the next lesson, what sort of types we can have for each column. And, but for the time being, all I want to do is to create a couple of tables, run a couple of queries on them, and then also want to have a look at the anatomy of the database file that where the data is being stored. I think that's all we need for this one. Oh yeah, let's just go and say the date as well. I'll call this data table called order. Okay, so under our database object, we now have tables and we have dbo.order. So ignore the dbo bit. .order it actually means the name of the table that we created. Let's create another table. Order item, for example. Order item, the order ID. Again, we're going to go through the structure of the normalized tables in the next couple of sessions or so. And then we go to SQL, for example, which is going to be our varchar field. Just varchar is a text field. Alright, let's save that as order item table. Right, so we now created two tables. And for the time being, let's just leave it as that. So we now created some data, and we can go and using SQL Management Studio, can go and insert some data into it. Let's say we insert an order ID as 1, customer name as Federer, and then order date as 2014 January, for example. Then another order, let's say Peter. Right, simple as that. So we can just basically directly insert the data. So the question is that most people don't even ask when they're working with SQL Server, where's that data stored and how? Right, as already kind of mentioned, it's stored in here in the new database. Well, basically in my MDF file. Interesting bit to know is how it actually stores the data. I mean, normally you wouldn't ask that question when you're working with a technology like SQL Server, but it's actually quite important to know how it stores the data because it then determines how you create the tables and what types of fields you actually use in those tables, because it greatly affects the performance of your queries and generally just makes sense to know how things work underneath the bonnet. So it's going to go screwing me again. Right. So imagine this whole screen is a database file. Well, without that bit. Okay. So the way SQL Server stores the data in the MDF file is in 8 kilobyte chunks. They called pages. So you've got a file and it's basically split, if you think about it, as a random access file into 8 kilobytes chunks. Those chunks are called pages. And each file, MDF file, starts with a first page called header, and then PFS page, and then some other pages. We're not going to go through sort of explain which each of those pages actually do. in this SQL Server data management engine. But all we need to know at the moment is the fact that it's a 8 kilobyte page, and there are some setup pages in the MDF file, and there are pages that contain data. So first 8 pages is almost like a configuration for the database itself, and then all the other pages effectively, apart from, we're going to look into where the other sequential pages appear, those pages contain data. Okay, so 8 pages consecutively is called an extent, and it's 64 kilobytes. And extents are used in SQL Server to manage free space. So whenever SQL Server needs to grow the file size, it does it in so-called extents. So for example, it takes 1 megabyte and creates, 64, how many extents it could fit in a megabyte, and basically grows the file in that length. Okay. So we've got first 8 pages that are basically our database header. Then data is stored in those pages up to about page number 8000. Then we've got another PFS file, PFS page, which determines where those pages are filled and so on. And then we've got some more pages, and then some other configuration, free space management pages, and so on, basically. So important thing to take away from this one is the fact that everything is stored in 8 kilobytes chunks, and each chunk basically represents a bit of data that relates to a specific table. And those things can be completely kind of spread across your database file completely randomly. For example, page number 1 can be my order table. Page number 2 can relate to my order item table. Page number 3 can relate back to my order item table, order table. Page number 4, and so on, basically. And I might have page number 7999, that is my order table, and page number 7998 is my, customer table, just a row. Okay? So, interesting to know how the data page, this page 8 kilobyte chunk actually stores the data. It's actually quite simple if you think about it. What it does is got something like 96 kilobytes, 96 bytes as a data header for each page, which actually specifies the ID of the page and which sort of page index file, basically this PFS file it relates to, and where it is in the file, etc. All those kind of data, and then it stores the data as a row. So you can store, within that 8 kilobyte, you can store row data, row 1, 2, and then some free space, and then we have row offset, something like 24 kilobytes, I think, or 24 bytes at the end of that 8 kilobyte chunk. We have some pointers to specify where our row 1 and row 2 is within that data header, within that data page file. Okay, and the whole thing is where we store the data is 8060 bytes long, plus the header plus the row offset makes it exactly 8 kilobytes. Right? So why is it important to know that it stores the data this way? Well, it's important to know it because it means that we can't have a row size. If we look at this, it stores each row on each page. So in theory, you can't have a row where sum of all columns are going to be more than 8060 bytes. So you can't have columns that sum of all their length are more than 8060 bytes in theory. We worked with, most of us have worked with SQL Server already, and you kind of question yourself, well, how come that's not true? You can have just basically create 3000 columns, and each one of those is going to have like a length of 100, and you don't have any problems. The reason why SQL Server allows you to do it is because it can carry that row to the next page. So, for example, we have a data page, and we store row number 1 out of the order table, and it's basically restoring column 1, and then we've got some data in there, column 2, some data, column 3, and so on. We've got lots of columns, and then we found out that we can't store this row on this page because we run out of space. So what SQL Server is doing is going to go and carry that row on the next page. And it's going to select the longest column and stick it on the next page effectively. And then if there is another column that doesn't fit on that page, it sticks on another one, and another one, and another one. So, and then where there is a row offset bit in that data file, it creates something like row overflow data pointers and pointing at the page where we created that page extension effectively. And if you think about how the SQL Server works with those files, because it's a concurrent writes and reads to those pages, it doesn't mean that that next page is going to be right next to the page where you actually start writing the data. It might end up that you start writing the data into this page, and some other process starts writing data into the next page. You might end up this page is, where your row number 1 is on page number, let's say 1000, and it continues on page number 2046. So obviously gathering this data back out of the database file for a server is going to be very difficult. So effectively just limit yourself to the idea that ideally you need to have rows where the sum of all column length is less than 8060 bytes. And if you think about it, it's much better if all your rows equate to a chunk that can fit on one page. So for example, a divisible of 8060 bytes, ideally. Then you don't have any free space on your pages because all the rows are going to be fitting into the page quite nicely. And nothing is going to be carried forward on another page. And also it's a really good idea to avoid large objects such as XML data or text, etc., to be within the same data, within the same table itself. It's a really good idea to just basically carry it forward onto another table effectively. Okay, right. So this is the anatomy of the database file. You can read a little bit more about it, but most of the information about how those files are structured is very, very technical. This is kind of a dumbed-down version of it. Right, let's actually go and run some queries. So we've got our data, we inserted some stuff into it. And what we can do is, let me just go back because I think I've done it a little bit too quick. Right, so we can run a query against the database. Query being a SQL language. I don't remember what it stands for, but it's got basically 4 commands in it: select, insert, update, delete. That's it, and lots other ones that do other things. But effectively, what we can do is we can query the server. So we can write something like select star from order. Okay, don't worry about the syntax just yet. What's going to happen if I press F5 is, if we think about this client-server paradigm, if we don't think that the server is installed on this machine, but it's installed somewhere else, let's say in the server room, this computer send a command to the server, well, a command request to the server to do something, effectively. So that server accepted that command, interpreted that, went into database file, this MDF file, read some data out of those pages, created, compiled it into something that it can throw back at the client over the network. The client then received it and showed me this table. Quite a lot of things happening, if I just press F5, quite a lot of things just happened. At the moment it's all happening within this laptop, but effectively that's the idea of the client-server paradigm. And we can query the server and control it and insert data using this SQL language, well, TSQL in our case. And you will be surprised, but everything that happens in the SQL server is happening through TSQL. The SQL bit itself, as I've already mentioned, contains only 4 commands in it, really, or a bit more than that, but it's a select, getting data out, insert, inserting data, updating, meaning that to update a specific row or a specific bit of data, and delete. That's basically it. Everything else is the T bit, which is called transact SQL. transact SQL bits, the T bit is actually allows us to control the server. So we can create store procedures. I'm going to mention them as little programs that you can basically embed within SQL Server. Then we can create new objects. It's called data. Well, basically, we can manipulate the data objects themselves. So we can create database, we can drop them, etc. That's all done through SQL, but it's done with basically TSQL, which is exactly the same kind of syntax. But right, so we can select data, and then we can also create so-called well, when we select data, we can specify a specific clause. We can say select from order where customer name equals something. That's better, and it's just going to return me one row because we can limit the data that we want to return from the server. In the basic terms, it gets a lot more complicated from that point onwards. Okay, and as I already mentioned, we can basically control how the server is. Well, we can create new objects using the same kind of language. So we can say create table, give it a name, customer, for example, and then specify columns. Like first name, okay. So what that command is going to do, indeed. Okay, so what that command is going to do is going to go and create a new table in our database. So if we refresh the tables, you can see there's a new customer table called customer. And by the same token, I can go and drop this table, meaning that I'm actually going to go and delete that table altogether, and so on. Okay, that's basically the basic terms. And as I mentioned before, we can do other things. Like for example, we can actually assign, well, we can create new users, we can assign roles to those users, etc. So let's come out of the super admin. As you can see at the top there, we actually have the fact that I'm connected to the server as a super admin. So let's go back into SQL Server Management Studio, but in this time I'm going to go in as a this user change man, I think I called him, and try to do something, some querying with the, from the database. So pretty much exactly the same as I did before. I'm going to create a new query, and I'm going to run exactly the same query that I ran using a super admin. I'm going to go and select from, in fact, I'll say use meaning that I'm going to switch the database to a new database. Go meaning that I want to actually execute that bit. Then select from order. Pretty much exactly the same query that I ran before as a super admin. If I run this, I'm getting this error. That basically means that I haven't got any rights to read any data out of it. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to give this user some rights. And in this case, instead of actually going through SQL Server management screens into users and roles, etc., I'm going to execute this. I'm going to give him rights by typing stuff into my command window. Well, that's where I'm using TSQL to actually run a function on the SQL Server to grant user changeman some rights to read data. So I'm going to exec meaning that I'm going to execute a store procedure. SP stands for, I think, for store procedure. Add role member. Data reader means that I'm going to give him a database role as a data reader only. And then the name of the user that I'm going to give it to is a changeman. Apparently the user doesn't exist. Hmm? Indeed, yes. Okay. Yes. First thing I need to do is to actually add this user. I mean, this user changeman, is a login to the server itself, but he hasn't got any access to the database itself. So I need to select the database, and then go into security, users, and say I want new user to be added, and then add this user as a user of the database itself. So I've got a login, but login doesn't mean that I can actually connect to the database. It just means that I can see its name, effectively. So again, and as membership of the database, I'm just going to specify nothing. Even though this user has got access to that database, he can't actually do anything with it because he hasn't got any roles, any permissions. Okay, once that user is in the database, now I can actually run this. There you go. It's saying its command completed successfully. So now I can basically switch to my user mode and run exactly the same query as before, and now I get some data back. Okay, so I get some data back, and if I refresh the database, you can see now I've been able to actually access it, and I can view some tables, and I can go and edit this table, and I can try to insert some data. Saying that I can't. And I can't because I only have access to the database as a data reader. So going forward, for example, what I can do is switch back to user admin. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and say this guy here, this user, can have a specific security access to a specific object in the database, and that object type is a table, and that table is order. Okay, and this order table, I want this guy to be able to insert data and select it as well, but he can select it because he's a data reader anyway, but he can also insert the data. Okay, and now we switch back. Now we try to basically do exactly the same operation as we've tried to do before, but this time it worked. Although I can insert data, I can't delete it because I haven't got any access. Well, I haven't got any permissions to do it. So again, we can go and say this guy can now also delete data. And again, if we try to come back to these SQL, well, basically Management Studio as a user changeman, and I can now go and delete this data. Okay, so that's the basic principle for user access and user roles and securities. Okay, that's about it.